Thanks everybody for joining us today, and it's great to see some familiar faces out there and familiar names. So hello, and just a very quick background about me. So I actually have my Bachelor of Science in Agroecology from UBC way back in 2004, and have been engaged in agriculture for a lot of my life. I am a proud Nalakapamic woman. My family comes from the Lytton First Nation, though I am one of the coastal cousins and grew up in Ladner. I'm speaking to you today from the lands of the Pentlich speaking people, so now known as Parksville, British Columbia, on the island, where we actually have a small farm where we focus on vegetable and fruit production, and sharing what we grow with others in need in the community. And yeah, I teach weed science at UBC, and I recently completed my PhD in integrated studies in land and food systems. And what I'm going to be sharing with you today is largely part of that research, which came from basically a career working in invasive species management and on ecological restoration and in agroecology, and just, feeling a little unsettled in that, it seemed like with all of the great efforts that we put forward to heal our lands and provide food for our communities, that we're just coming up short, in spite of all of these great efforts. So this was really a dive into figuring out, what the Indigenous worldview could offer us in respect to those. And so today I'm going to be talking about the power of the Indigenous worldview in applied science, sharing with you what it did for my own work, and hopefully giving you examples from my own experiences that I'm really hoping will give you some tools for perhaps reimagining the work that you're engaged in today. So I'm just going to jump right in. So I should say that sharing in my culture is done, largely by oral tradition. So I'm actually going to honor that today. So I will allow you to rest your Zoom weary eyes if you have them like I do. I don't mind if you turn your screens off at all. And I think it is important for us to, learn in using oral tradition, because it allows us to experience what we're hearing a little bit differently, away from sometimes the distraction of slides. So I really hope that you enjoy that sort of experience and take it in maybe a different way than you're used to. So when my research journey began, I set out actually to examine the impacts of invasive species on Indigenous food security and food sovereignty. And through all the twists and turns and stops and starts of the journey, the focus shifted and a new narrative emerged. Early in my research journey, Cowichan elder Peter Williams told me that the greatest journey a man can take is that between his head and his heart. And that's what my research journey documented, how I would connect my head, the dominant Western scientific worldview, to my heart, my Indigenous worldview. And it's my hope that the lessons that we learned during that journey that I share with you today will help shed light on what I hope will be a new dimension of climate adaptation focused agricultural research, one that embraces and learns to apply the Indigenous worldview. Chief Dan George of the Tsleil-Waututh Nation said, "Can we talk of integration of hearts and minds? Unless you have this, you have only a physical presence, and the walls between us are as high as the mountain range." So he's talking here about the integration of Indigenous children into the school system. But this very much applies to what we're talking about today. You see, what I've come to realize is that while it's wonderful that our traditional ecological knowledge is being recognized as valuable, the walls between us remain. The wall is that there's a lack of recognition of where our traditional ecological knowledge comes from. And what I mean is that so many don't know that the formation of our knowledge comes from our worldview, a relational worldview, a worldview that sees the world as a series of connections that span space and time, a worldview that brings to life things that are normally objectified. one that places us within the ecosystem as equals to all of our other relations, with the great responsibility of the role of providing balance within the system to ensure that the needs of our communities are met and our values are respected. It is, simply put, an ecology that is lived. While our Indigenous communities are distinctly unique, in my work, I've found it's this worldview that unites us. So to use fragmented pieces of our knowledge is for us to only have that physical presence. You don't know us, and this makes our knowledge vulnerable to misuse and our communities vulnerable to misunderstanding. It also continues to colonize our knowledge by freezing our contributions in time, restricting our contributions to the past. It's truly to admire a tree without admiring its roots. You must know and appreciate our roots to understand our real power, our worldview. These are the headwaters from which our knowledge flows. And only then can you see the world as we do and realize the full benefit of what we have to offer. Embracing our relational Indigenous worldview and applying it to science. And this is what I refer to as an academic time of the eagle. Jane Goodall, in her book, Reason for Hope, A Spiritual Journey, stressed the importance of taking up a new worldview to be able to make the old new again, unquote, so that we may rise to the challenges posed by our current context. The Indigenous worldview, to me, seemed like such an opportunity. But I have to tell you, it's a lot easier said than done. And it turned out that the journey between my head, Western science, and my heart, Indigenous worldview, was a much bumpier, windier road that sounded a lot more romantic, as I said out in the beginning, than it actually turned out to be. Because embracing the Indigenous worldview and subsequently using Indigenous research methodology in my own fields of study, work that I've been doing for almost 2 decades for farmers and government agencies, was all rooted in Western science. And this was really difficult. Even as an Indigenous woman, personally invested in doing this, I still couldn't help but listen to that chastising scientist on my shoulder, shaking her finger at me for embracing methods that seemed like scientific sacrilege. It's a very complicated internal conflict. There was no way that I could simply turn off scientific Jen to embrace making the old new again. My research offers a guide for this most necessary journey, the journey that allows us to experience the benefits of what I refer to as this academic time of the eagle. The trick is that to get to this academic time of the eagle, we each have some hard work to do. You see, changing worldviews is not as simple as simply flipping a switch. My research documented this particular struggle, with the result being a creation, I hope, of a trail for others, Indigenous and non-Indigenous, to follow. So what is a time of the eagle? I was taught in my culture that we recognize that children are in the time of the eagle. And this is a precious stage of life where you're closest to the creator. And parenting is a ceremony where we guide our children towards the fulfillment of their life's purpose. As guides, it's so important to let them be free during this time of the eagle. It's a time of self-exploration, a time of building foundational relationships, to allow them to find and embrace what it is that makes them uniquely themselves and to discover their gifts. It's by no means a free-ranging type scenario, but one that's filled with aunties and uncles and cousins, keeping an eye on their physical and spiritual safety without unnecessary constraints. And when I think about today's academia and Western scientific research, I think about this childhood time of the eagle. And I think, what would it be like if our research had this type of freedom? What a contrast to what we're currently experiencing under the dominant research paradigm. I really believe that we are living a stifling childhood mired with constraints, and we need to experience an academia that is more like this time of the eagle. There are obviously challenges of introducing a new paradigm to academia. We're up against a lot. There is so often an obsession with the question of which is better when we talk about paradigms. And we have to move away from this which is better question and instead ask ourselves, what is the result of research programs where two different cultural approaches are utilized? Imagine the potential of what two differing worldviews could bring if they were given an equal platform to contribute. Imagine if we could learn ourselves to change how we see the world when problem solving and realize the benefits of being able to do that. I see those of us on this call today fulfilling an important role that Bowensky and Maru referred to as intercultural knowledge bridgers. And in academia, I would call this a new dimension of what it is to be an interdisciplinarian. An academic time of the eagle allows us to depart from research confined by the guise of objectivity. It provides us the freedom without risk of persecution to explore new ideas, other methods of acquisition of knowledge, and how we arrive at our conclusions. We can create work that's the realization of the potential that comes from the unchaining of researchers otherwise bound by the rules and culture of the dominant Western scientific worldview. The resistance to both alternate points of view and any departure from the dominant Western scientific paradigm are not unique to my own fields of study in invasion biology and agroecology or ecological restoration. I have certainly experienced them, as my colleagues on this call probably have. I was even once told by a very important mentor in my life that I shouldn't bother with all of this indigenous stuff because it undermined me as a scientist. As disappointing as that is, it's just not that unusual. The protectionist culture of any field of scientific study and defense of their cornerstone, the dominant paradigm, is to be expected. The question is whether this self-protecting culture is best serving the interests of the academy and society. It may seem like it, but I'm not beating up on Western science itself. It's provided us with a way to formulate important research questions, find reliable answers, and build upon the work done by others. It serves a very important function. It has a role to play in acquisition of knowledge and the progress of society. My criticism is that this paradigm has a culture that has morphed it into an ideology of academia, the only acceptable ideology of academia. Transitioning to an academic time of the eagle sets the context for us to build the bridge between the Western scientific paradigm and Indigenous worldview. Scientists from the dominant paradigm will have to acknowledge and move away from a tendency that Simpson pointed out, that some of our ways of thinking may be more a product of disciplinary inheritance, habits, and tendencies adopted from the scientists who preceded us, unquote. Well, the importance of embracing plurality in ecological thought has been emphasized many times over the years. I believe that embracing an Indigenous worldview takes us beyond a simple introduction of perspective. It changes how we see our work. It changes how we do our work. It changes how we interpret our work. So what did an academic time of the eagle look like for me, plant scientist, weed scientist, invasion biologist? Well, Dr. Peter Cole, an Indigenous academic in education at UBC, sent me this beautiful poem that he wrote in response to my email expressing frustration of embracing the Indigenous worldview in my own work. And his words gave me the first permission to leave those feelings behind and do what I felt like I needed to do. He really provided me a first taste of what Indigenous research methodology is all about. And he said, or wrote, write in your own way, think in your own way, research in your own way. Don't think you have to ask permission. How long does it have to go on for? Quote your elders and your children and the wind, the waves, the clouds. They are always telling you stories, listening to your stories. One of the first things I did was to create what I referred to as my statements of truth in order to release myself deliberately from the constraints of what I felt from the dominant paradigm. And I actually included these in my dissertation so that those who are reading my work were aware that I knew exactly what I was doing. So I'm just going to give you a few examples of what those were. I give myself permission to stop attempting to create the illusion of objectivity. I give myself permission to openly express my personal connection to my work. I give myself permission to not ask whether how I conduct my research is the right way. I give myself permission to embrace discovery in whichever way seems right. I give myself permission to learn lessons however they may arise. I give myself permission to learn from all who cross my path. I give myself permission to defend my work from colonization. I give myself permission to stop engaging in processes that require me to legitimize my work. I give myself permission to not be afraid of the repercussions of producing work outside of the dominant worldview. Embracing these truths helped me to navigate my inner struggle, allowing me to work differently. For so much of my early research, I sat with elders and knowledge keepers around fires deep in the bush as a welcomed guest in their homes and often in Tim Hortons, and I listened. I stopped trying to control the conversation and I let it go wherever it needed to. I sat by myself on important lands to my Couch and friends, mainly in remote areas at elevation around Couch and Lake and in Garry Oak Meadows. And I sat with the plants whether they belonged or not. And I sat without the iPad that I so desperately wanted to grab and start doing surveys, without a notebook, without an agenda. And I watched and I listened. And I laid down among the camas and the chocolate lilies and I breathed it all in and I considered it all. I also wandered, talking to myself out loud, talking to the plants, listening to the birds. I gave myself the gift of time. I freed myself from the feelings that I was being inefficient or unproductive. I sought out anyone that had anything to do with the areas I was working on and just talked to them. Some more obvious characters, biologists, soil scientists, government employees, NGOs, and then the less obvious, conservation officers, hunters, fishermen, school district employees, chefs, dog walkers. My academic time of the Eagle taught me the most important lessons about land, stewardship, food systems, invasion biology, and ecology than I had learned in almost 2 decades of work. Why? Because I took all that valuable knowledge that I gained from my education and its application in the field and had the space to consider them in entirely new ways. I had the space and time to find connections between them all that I had never considered before. And those connections have given traction to the wheels I feel like we've been spinning for far too long. And I'm just going to share some of what my academic time of the Eagle revealed in my own research in hopes of giving you an idea of its potential. And I really do hope that it inspires you to consider what it might bring to your own work. And for me, the overarching lesson in all of this is about the power of story in ecology. And I'm going to go through that in a few different ways. First is that the importance of the story of the history of the fields of study that we're engaged in and the impacts of that story on our work today. So I examined the history and foundations of modern ecology, and it became clear that its foundation, the Christian story, has a profound impact on both the understanding and application of ecology. I ended up referring to modern ecology as Eden ecology and demonstrated how the unintended consequence of its foundational roots in the Judeo-Christian tradition has an impact on how we approach land healing and relatedly food security. Well, I'll be sharing more about this in a little bit. Eden ecology places humans outside of our ecosystem and does not recognize their essential role within it. It disregards the legacy of how our ecosystems were shaped by Indigenous peoples on these lands since time immemorial by perpetuating colonial concepts such as natural areas, natural landscapes, wilderness, restoration. I have called for a shift to what I called an Indigenous ecology that places ecology back on its relational foundation, putting humans back inside the system as an essential part of its function and hands back their leadership responsibilities within that system. A reclaimed foundation set by Indigenous stories before contact that alters the trajectory of how we bring healing to our land and waters and plan for a future with a changing climate. Secondly, In the ecological stories of today, the language of our stories matters. So the language that we use to describe and direct our work matters. It alters our relationship with the land and the water and all of our relations. I introduced a new terminology that I hope will be more reflective of the relational worldview. As an example, the term restoration, the very name of the field, ecological restoration, implies by its very definition in the Oxford Dictionary as the action of returning one thing to a former owner, place, or condition. Mills, in a well-known restoration book, In Service of the Wild, Restoring and Re-inhabiting Damaged Land, defined it as the art and science of repairing damaged ecosystems to the greatest possible degree of historical authenticity. So whose story? Which arbitrary point in time? And for whom are we doing this work? Is this really the right term for what we're trying to do? Does putting stuff back the way we think it's supposed to be prepare us and our relations for a changing climate? I began the development of new terminology for ecology that is reflective of this Indigenous ecology, and this was done in partnership with Cowichan tribes as well as government agencies and environmental nonprofits interested in applying Indigenous ecology. So as an example, using the term healing instead of restoration. Healing does not infer an automatic intention of returning something to a particular state. And most importantly, it offers us greater flexibility and scope of what we mean by healing. It's no longer limited to putting something back the way it was. As we work to create a new story moving forward, healing does not limit us by a predetermined notion of what our actions should be. It allows us to respond to the needs of all relations of the day and determine the appropriate ways to bring that healing. So please, as you leave today, I really want you to think about how much words matter. They can change the story of what we're doing. And I urge you to think about how terminology that you use in your own work and research influences how you think about it and its direction. Another lesson is that we have to listen to and consider the stories of our relations today. So that when we're collecting data and when we're evaluating land, we need to get personal. We need to ask the soil, the plants, the insects, the animals, whichever relation you're studying, what's your story? Specificity matters. And so often in land healing, invasive species management, we've allowed ourselves to apply generalized principles of plant physiology and invasion biology to generalized context. So for example, naturalized areas or agrarian landscapes. We repeat generalized impacts of invasive species like displacing native vegetation and reducing biodiversity to justify action, but we can't do that. Before we finalize research questions, before we develop a research or control program, we better ask whichever relation we study, what's your story? The example from my own research project was a repeated failure of establishing meadow bunch grasses and herbaceous plants on what is supposed to be a garryoak oak ecosystem. So when I sat among the weeds, and I could have taught the entire weed science course from where I was sitting, I found myself kind of digging my fingers into the soil in frustration, and I held my hand up in front of my face, and looking at the soil beneath my fingertips, I actually said out loud, "What is your story?" And it felt weird at first, but then as I looked out at the sea of Canada thistle and Scotch broom and common tansy, I found myself also saying to them, "What's your story?" And being led by that, wrote the story of the soil and the weeds of this former village site of the Cowichan people. And there were 100 years of history of these garryoak oaks providing shade for the cows whose pastures these were. You see, these weren't the soils of a garryoak oak ecosystem. These were anthropogenic soils. So of course, what we were trying to do wasn't working. Of course, there were a sea of weeds that we just couldn't get control of. Of course, this restoration recipe for garryoak oak ecosystems wasn't working. So the stories of what we're studying help us to know what we're studying better. And by doing that, we can then understand their relationships better. And finally, we have to create stories for the future for us to actually be able to bring healing to these places. We need to create a story for the future of these places. What do we want the story of these places to be? And this is fundamental to the application of what I call an Indigenous ecology. The creation of such a story is a tremendous responsibility. It requires us to think of all in whom we need to consider. It requires us to address at times very complicated and sometimes opposing interests. It means wholly accepting the tremendous responsibility of being a human in the ecosystem. What do we want this place to be? How can we shape our lands and waters to be that? This is how these projects fall into assumptions of generalized restoration, resulting in actions that don't necessarily serve the community, don't necessarily serve the plant, animal, and insect relations. These are often doomed to long-term failure, but by creating a story for the future, we examine possibilities and we find connections that can help us to meet our goals. It makes us think forwards creatively. The bottom line is, if we want to take steps toward ecological reconciliation, we cannot place all hope on inclusion and fragmented pieces of knowledge to make the difference. Colonized processes typical of government-driven multi-stakeholder decision-making meetings and consultations, as well as research from the dominant paradigm, will not magically spit out a decolonized product. And having been the token of many of these processes, it took me until my own research process, almost 2 decades later, to figure this out. If we want a decolonized result, we need a decolonized process. This applies to research. My research journey taught me the importance of an academic time of the eagle and about the power of story. An academic time of the eagle will allow us to reclaim our ability to adapt to a changing climate by doing research our way, something taken from our communities by settler notions of how we are to live on the land, how we're to understand the world, and what knowledge is valued. All things imposed upon us that perpetuate the colonial influences on our land today, things that I believe are inhibiting adaptation. But see, the time is right. And here we are. We have some things to teach you. So let us lead. Let us be brave and embrace this worldview so that we can move forward together. Remember, we are the adaptation experts on these lands. When you're a child, the time of the academic eagle is more natural, easier. When you're an adult, it's hard to create a time of the eagle compared to when you're a kid. We have obligations, responsibilities, experiences, finite time, funding, deadlines, and only so much energy. We have to be purposeful in creating this opportunity for ourselves. We have to do the work together to accomplish this. That is what I hope to do here with all of you. Create a space and explore opportunities for an academic time of the eagle at every part of our food system. The creation of space for us today in this forum is an important first step, but we have to be open to creating and pursuing new research questions and methodology that honor who we are as Indigenous people and our worldview. Then we will have truly dropped the walls between us. Let us work together to connect our heads and hearts. I'm going to leave you with a quote today from an elder who I've had the privilege of learning from and still am learning from. His name is Luschim, and he's from Cowichan Tribes, and he gave me permission to share this with you today. He said, "Everything is what sustains us. Everything is interconnected on this land. We are all connected. Even though we don't eat the grass, the deer eat certain grasses. Even though we don't eat that worm, others eat that worm and keep the ground aerated. So everything's got a purpose. Everything is what sustains us. Everything is interconnected." Coach Chem, thank you.